So, hello and welcome back yet again to another two chapters of the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where the last time we met Dr. Jekyll, who pressed his lawyer on the fact that he did not want any interference with his will and that Mr. Utterson, his lawyer, should drop the subject of his friend, Mr. Hyde. And then in the next chapter, a year after this conversation, Mr. Hyde attacked and murdered someone in, I wouldn't say broad daylight, it was late at night, but in full view of a young woman who was able to describe him. The police and Mr. Utterson went to Dr. Jekyll's or Mr. Hyde's house, and he was nowhere to be seen. He seems to be on the lam. So that is where we left off, and we are going to be picking things back up with chapter number 5, The Incident of the Letter. It was late in the afternoon when Mr. Utterson found his way to Dr. Jekyll's door, where he was at once admitted by Poole and carried down by the kitchen offices and across a yard which had once been a garden to the building which was indifferently known as the laboratory or the dissecting rooms. The doctor had bought the house from the heirs of a celebrated surgeon, and his own tastes being rather chemical than anatomical, had changed the destination of the block at the bottom of the garden. It was the first time that the lawyer had been received in that part of his friend's quarters, and he eyed the dingy, windowless structure with curiosity, and gazed around with a distasteful sense of strangeness as he crossed the theater, once crowded with eager students and now lying gaunt and silent, the tables laden with chemical apparatuses, the floor strewn with crates and littered with packing straw, and the light falling dimly through the foggy cupola. At the further end, a flight of stairs mounted to a door covered with a red baize, and through this Mr. Utterson was at last received into the doctor's cabinet. It was a large room, fitted round with glass presses, furnished, among other things, with a cheval glass and a business table, and looking out upon the court by 3 dusty windows barred with iron. The fire burned in the grate. A lamp was set lighted on the chimney shelf, for even in the houses the fog began to lie thickly, and there, close up to the warmth, sat Dr. Jekyll, looking deadly sick. He did not rise to meet his visitor, but held out a cold hand and bade him welcome in a changed voice. "And now," said Mr. Utterson, as soon as Poole had left them, "you have heard the news?" The doctor shuddered. "They were crying it in the square," he said. "I heard them in my dining room." "One word," said the lawyer. "Carew was my client, but so are you, and I want to know what I am doing. You have not been mad enough to hide this fellow?" "Utterson, I swear to God," cried the doctor, "I swear to God I will never set eyes on him again. I bind my honor to you that I am done with him in this world. It is all at an end. And indeed, he does not want my help. You do not know him as I do. He is safe. He is quite safe. Mark my words. He will never more be heard of." The lawyer listened gloomily. He did not like his friend's feverish manner. "You seem pretty sure of this," said he, "and for your sake, I hope you may be right. If it has come to trial, your name might appear. I am quite sure of him, replied Jekyll. I have grounds for certainty that I cannot share with anyone. But there is one thing on which you may advise me. I have received a letter, and I am at a loss whether I should show it to the police. I should like to leave it in your hands, Utterson. You would judge wisely, I am sure. I have so great a trust in you. You fear, I suppose, that it might lead to his detection, said the lawyer. No, said the other. I cannot say that I care what becomes of Hyde. I am quite done with him. I was thinking of my own character, which this hateful business has rather exposed. Utterson ruminated a while. He was surprised at his friend's selfishness, and yet relieved by it. Well, he said at last, let me see the letter. The letter was written in an odd upright hand and signed Edward Hyde, and it signified, briefly enough, that the writer's benefactor, Dr. Jekyll, whom he had long so unworthily replayed for 1,000 generosities, need labor under no alarm for his safety, as he had means of escape on which he placed a sure dependence. The lawyer liked the letter well enough. It put a better color on the intimacy than he had looked for, and he blamed himself for some of his past suspicions. Have you the envelope? He asked. I burned it, said Jekyll, before I thought what it was about. But it bore no postmark. The note was handed in. Shall I keep this and sleep upon it? Said Utterson. I wish you to judge me for it entirely, was the reply. I have lost confidence in myself. Well, I shall consider, returned the lawyer. And now one more word. It was Hyde who dictated the terms of your will about that disappearance? The doctor seemed seized with a qualm of faintness. He shut his mouth tight and nodded. I knew it, said Utterson. He meant to murder you. You have had a fine escape. I have had what is far more to the purpose, said the doctor solemnly. I have had a lesson. Oh God, Utterson, what a lesson I have had. And he covered his face for a moment with his hands. On his way out, the lawyer stopped and had a word or two with Poole. By the by, said he, there was a letter handed in today. What was the messenger like? But Poole was positive nothing had come except by post, and only circulars by that, he said. This news sent off the visitor with his fears renewed. Plainly, the letter had come by the laboratory door. Possibly, indeed, it had been written in the cabinet, and if that were so, it must be differently judged and handled with more caution. The newsboys, as he went, were crying themselves hoarse along the footways. Special edition! Shocking murder of an MP! That was the funeral oration of one friend and client, and he could not help a certain apprehension lest the good name of another should be sucked down in the eddy of this scandal. It was at least a ticklish decision that he had to make, and self-reliant as he was by habit, he began to cherish a longing for advice. It was not to be had directly, but perhaps he thought it might be fished for. Presently, after he sat on one side of his own hearth, with Mr. Guest, his head clerk, upon the other, and midway between, a nicely calculated distance from the fire, a bottle of a particular old wine that had long dwelt unstunned in the foundations of his home, The fog still slept on the wing above the drowned city, where the lamps glimmered like carbuncles, and through the muffle and smother of those fallen clouds, the procession of the town's life was still rolling through the great arteries with the sound as of a mighty wind. But the room was gay with firelight. In the bottle, the acids were long ago resolved. The imperial dye had softened with time as the color grows richer in stained windows, and the glow of hot autumn afternoons on hillside vineyards was ready to be set free and to disperse the fog of London. Insensibly, the lawyer melted. There was no man from whom he kept fewer secrets than Mr. Guest, and he was not always sure that he kept as many as he meant. Guest had often been on business to the doctor's. He knew Poole. He could scarce have failed to hear of Mr. Hyde's familiarity about that house. He might have drawn conclusions, but it was not as well, then, that he should see a letter which put that mystery to rights? And above all, since Guest, being a great student and critic of handwriting, would consider it natural and obliging. The clerk, as well, was a man of counsel. He would scarce read that strange document without dropping a remark, and by that remark Mr. Utterson might shape his future course. "This is a sad business about Sir Danvers," he said. "Oh, yes, indeed. It has elicited a great deal of public feeling," said Guest. "The man, of course, was mad." "I should like to hear your views on that," said Utterson. "I have a document here in his handwriting. It is between ourselves, for I scarce know what to do about it. It is an ugly business at the best. But there's quite in your way a murderer's autograph." Guest's eyes brightened, and he sat down at once and studied it with passion. "No, sir," he said, "not mad, but it is an odd hand." "And by all accounts a very odd writer," said the lawyer. Just then the servant entered with a note. "Is that from Dr. Jekyll, sir?" said the clerk. "I thought I knew the writing. Anything private, Mr. Utterson?" "Only an invitation to dinner. Why, do you want to see it?" "One moment, I thank you, sir." And the clerk laid the 2 sheets of paper alongside and sendously compared their contents. "Thank you, sir," he said at last, returning both. "It is a very interesting autograph." There was a pause, during which Mr. Utterson struggled with himself. "Why did you compare them, Guest?" he asked suddenly. "Well, sir," said the clerk, "there's a rather singular resemblance. The 2 hands are in many points identical, only differently sloped." "Rather quaint," said Utterson. "It is, as you say, rather quaint," said Mr. Guest. "I wouldn't speak of this note, you know." "No, sir," said the clerk, "I understand." But no sooner was Mr. Utterson alone that night than he locked the note in his safe, where it reposed from that time forward. "What?" he thought. "Henry Jekyll, forged for a murderer?" And his blood ran cold in his veins. We are going to move on to the next chapter in just a moment. All right. And on to Chapter 6 of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, titled Remarkable Incident of Dr. Lanyon. Time ran on. Thousands of pounds were offered in reward, for the death of Sir Danvers was resented as public injury. But Mr. Hyde had disappeared out of the ken of police as though he had never existed. Much of his past was unearthed, indeed, and all disreputable. Tales came out of the man's cruelty, at once so callous and violent, of his vile life, of his strange associates, of the hatred that seemed to have surrounded his career. But of his present whereabouts, not a whisper. From the time he had left the house in Soho on the morning of the murder, he was simply blotted out, and gradually, as time grew on, Mr. Utterson began to recover from the hotness of his alarm and to grow more at quiet with himself. The death of Sir Danvers was, to his way of thinking, more than paid for by the disappearance of Mr. Hyde. Now that evil influence had been withdrawn, a new life began for Dr. Jekyll. He came out of his seclusion, renewed relations with his friends, became once more their familiar guest and entertainer, and whilst he had always been known for charities, he was now no less distinguished for religion. He was busy. He was much in the open air. He did good. His face seemed to open and brighten, as if with an inward consciousness of service, and for more than 2 months the doctor was at peace. On the 8th of January, Utterson had dined at the doctor's with a small party. Lanyon had been there, and the face of the host had looked from one to the other as in the old days when the trio were inseparable friends. On the 12th, and again on the 14th, the door was shut against the lawyer. The doctor was confined to the house, Poole said, and saw no one. On the 15th, Utterson tried again, and again was refused. And now, having been used for the last 2 months to see his friend almost daily, he found this return of solitude to weigh on his spirits. The 5th night, he had in Mr. Guest to dine with him, and the 6th he betook himself to Dr. Lanyon's. There, at least, he was not denied admittance, but when he came in, he was shocked at the change that had taken place in the doctor's appearance. He had his death warrant written legibly on his face. The rosy man had grown pale, his flesh had fallen away, he was visibly balder and older, and yet it was not so much these tokens of a swift physical decay that arrested the lawyer's notice. It was a look in the eye and a quality of manner that seemed to testify to some deep-seated terror of the mind. It was unlikely that the doctor should fear death, and yet that was what Utterson was tempted to suspect. Yes, he thought, he is a doctor. He must know his own state, and that his days are counted, and the knowledge is more than he can bear. And yet, when Utterson remarked on his ill looks, it was with an air of great firmness that Lanyon declared himself a doomed man. "I have had the shock," he said, "and I shall never recover. It is a question of weeks. Well, life has been pleasant. I liked it. Yes, sir, I used to like it. I sometimes think, if we knew all, we should be more glad to get away." "Jekyll is ill, too," said Mr. Utterson. "Have you seen him?" But Lanyon's face changed, and he held up a trembling hand. "I wish to see or hear no more of Dr. Jekyll," he said in a loud, unsteady voice. "I am quite done with that person, and I beg that you will spare me any allusion to one who I regard as dead." "Tut, tut," said Mr. Utterson. And then, after a considerable pause, "Can't I do anything?" he inquired. "We are 3 very old friends, Lanyon. We shall not live to make others." "Nothing can be done," said Lanyon. "Ask himself." "He will not see me," said the lawyer. "I am not surprised at that," was the reply. Some day, Utterson, after I am dead, you may perhaps come to learn the right and wrong of this. I cannot tell you. And in the meantime, if you can sit and talk with me of other things, for God's sake, stay and do so. But if you cannot keep clear of this accursed topic, then in God's name go, for I cannot bear it. As soon as he got home, Utterson sat down and wrote to Jekyll, complaining of his exclusion from the house and asking the cause of this unhappy break with Lanyon. And the next day brought him a long answer, often very pathetically worded and sometimes darkly mysterious in drift. The quarrel with Lanyon was incurable. I do not blame our old friend, Jekyll wrote, but I share his view that we must never meet. I mean, from henceforth to lead a life of extreme seclusion. You must not be surprised, nor must you doubt my friendship if my door is often shut even to you. You must suffer me to go my own dark way. I have brought upon myself a punishment and a danger that I cannot name. If I am the chief of sinners, I am the chief of sufferers also. I should not think that this earth contained a place for sufferings and terrors so unmanning. And you can do but one thing, Utterson, to lighten this destiny, and that is to respect my silence. Utterson was amazed. The dark influence of Hades had been withdrawn. The doctor had returned to his old tasks and amenities. A week ago, the prospect had smiled with every promise of cheerful and honored age, and now in a moment, friendship and peace of mind and the whole tenor of his life were wrecked. So many great and unprepared of a change pointed to madness, but in view of Lanyon's manner and words, there must lie far deeper a ground. A week afterward, Dr. Lanyon took to his bed, and in something less than a fortnight he was dead. The night after the funeral, at which he had been sadly affected, Utterson locked the door of his business room, and sitting there by the light of a melancholy candle, drew out and set before him an envelope addressed by the hand and sealed with the seal of his dead friend. Private, for the hands of J.G. Utterson alone, and in case of his predecease, to be destroyed unread. So it was emphatically subscribed, and the lawyer dreaded to behold the contents. I've buried one friend today, he thought. What if this should cost me another? And then he condemned the fear as disloyalty and broke the seal. Within, there was another enclosure, likewise sealed, and marked upon the cover as not to be opened till the death or disappearance of Dr. Henry Jekyll. Utterson could not trust his eyes. Yes, it was disappearance. Here again, as in the mad will, which he had long ago restored to its author. Here again were the idea of a disappearance and the name of Henry Jekyll bracketed, but in the will, that idea had sprung from the sinister suggestion of the man Hyde. It was set there with a purpose, and all too plain and horrible. Written by the hand of Lanyon, what should it mean? A great curiosity came on the trustee to disregard the prohibition and dive at once to the bottom of these mysteries. But professional honor and faith in his dead friend were stringent obligations, and the packet slept in the innermost corner of his private safe. It is one thing to mortify curiosity, another to conquer it, and it may be doubted if from that day forth Utterson desired the society of his surviving friend with the same eagerness. He thought of him kindly, but his thoughts were disquieted and fearful. He went to call indeed, but he was perhaps relieved to be denied admittance. Perhaps, in his heart, he desired to speak with Poole upon the doorstep, surrounded by the air and sounds of the open city, rather than to be admitted into that house of voluntary bondage, and to sit and speak with its inscrutable recluse. Poole had indeed no very pleasant news to communicate. The doctor, it appeared, now more than ever confined himself to the cabinet over the laboratory, where he would sometimes even sleep. He was out of spirits. He had grown very silent. He did not read. It seemed as if he had something on his mind. Utterson became so used to the unvarying character of these reports that he fell off little by little in the frequency of his visiting. And that is where the chapter ends. So, obviously, the great Dr. Lanyon must have seen something at Dr. Jekyll's house, and something that disturbed him so greatly that it drove him to fade away. I don't think that a shock works that way, but it does work that way in fiction, and so we are going to roll with that. You know, this almost makes me want to maybe seek out a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde movie, because that's another thing. I have not only never read this before, I've never actually seen any of the Jekyll and Hyde movies. Again, I know of this only through cultural osmosis and, the things that everybody knows. It's kind of neat to actually read them in person, so to say. So, interesting. I still really like the flow of language in this. It's not a hard read. It just sometimes is structured so differently than modern books. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does have to make me rewire my brain a little bit, which honestly might be a good thing. It's good to challenge yourself now and then, which is what this book and all the rest of the books that we will read going forward hopefully will do. I'm looking forward to diving into more of the classics, and I'm also looking forward to maybe digging around and finding some of the not classics. I mean, the ones that have been lauded as classics are well and good, and hopefully we will enjoy them. But I'm kind of curious to find more of the older books that maybe weren't so well known, because maybe there are some really hidden gems out there. So I'm going to keep digging into the used bookstores, and we will keep enjoying this. Thank you, as always, for joining me tonight, and I will see you again as we read a couple more chapters next time.